thank you, Professor Tawakkoli Targhi, for inviting me to join this distinguished institution for at least one evening. I also like to thank the Foundation for Iranian Studies for their support, and all my friends who are here who've been very encouraging to me to be with you tonight. But I also like to share with you, if I may, the economic reasons for the revolution in Iran. That was the topic of the seminar. And over a 3-hour period, having covered a number of written work on the subject, we came to the conclusion that perhaps economic issues were not necessarily the full story behind the revolution of Iran, even though they might have had something to do with it. I tried to make a case that the Central Bank of Iran certainly had nothing to do with it, even though it was not very convincing. But there were a number of topics I think are worth recalling again tonight. That is that during the period under our discussion, that is 1960 to 78, a number of developments had happened in Iran. Subsequent to that, since the revolution, also many developments have taken place on the economic side of the country, where one begins to look for certain continuity and certain contrast. Clearly, the revolution in 1979 was a major disruption, or at least departure from the previous practices. But eventually, if you look at some of the live discussions in Iran today about economic policies, they begin to be very familiar in one's ears, including, for example, a statement by the Minister of Economic Affairs and Finance in the new administration of Iran, when he was trying to explain some of the problems which had arisen out of the economic policies followed in the previous administration. He made the point that it was not the first time that we have made these mistakes. And then he referred to the time of the Shah, where in fact he felt that the same policies as Mr. Ahmadinejad had been followed. And what were those policies, and what are those continuing elements in the Iranian economy which seems to serve as the underpinning of some of the problems that we may face or some of the successes we might have experienced? I made a case, or at least I reminded my audience last night, and I'd like to summarize it today and tonight. That is that when you look at the history of Iran, history of modern Iran, and the books written about it, often you go back to 1906, which is the start, of course, of the constitutional revolution of Iran. And we also have a number of other major markers in our history. The best example, of course, is the most recent one of February 11, 1979, the day of the revolution. But we also have August 19th, Bistashte Mordad. We have the time of the coming to power of Reza Shah and a number of other markers. There is one date in Iranian history that often we don't know about, or certainly it's not part of our consciousness. It happens to be May 26, 1908. And it didn't happen in Tehran, as often most events happen in Iran. It happened in Masjid Suleiman in Khuzestan. It was 116 degrees Fahrenheit, nothing like Toronto. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. And it was when oil, for the first time, erupted at the height of about 1,000 feet, as observed by Mr. Wilson, who was then commanding an Indian army, who were to protect the workers who were exploiting oil at the time. It says a little bit about Iran of that day, but it also marks a day that Iran never was the same again. to understand monetary policy in Iran, to understand the economic policies of Iran, to understand the blessings and the curse of oil income is synonymous. What is it about oil which is so special? On the political side, it's worth remembering that it was a concession given to foreigners. It was a concession given to foreigners who were totally autonomous in exploiting those resources under their concession. The word itself, concession, is politically loaded. You're extending a concession to a foreigner to exploit in exchange for a highly capital-intensive industry, which you continue to depend on foreigners for supply of technology, for markets, and for machinery. The other aspect of oil is that ultimately, certainly in my time, the production cost related to the selling price of oil is totally disproportionate. At a time that when we were selling it for $12, it was probably about 15 or 20 cents. This enormous difference explains why, in terms of oil production, there is no countervailing activity in line with that amount of income inside the economy. As such, therefore, it becomes basically a kind of a wealth that you would then distribute. And the emphasis is on distribution. Therefore, given the fact that the government is the main owner of the resource, so what happens is that, how does the government distribute oil income? In terms of economic jargon, what we are really talking about is that what matters most in a developing country, especially in a highly populated country, is fiscal policy. It's what happens to the oil money, how is it spent by the government? Once you make a decision about that, once you make a decision about the way in which the budget is to be distributed within the country, you are then talking about what happens to the economy. And the difference or the similarity between the administration of Mr. Ahmadinejad, at least in the words of this observer, and the Shah was that they were also trying to put the oil money on the tables of each Iranian. What happens to the monetary policy in this context, therefore, is a matter of an enormous amount of liquidity that is generated inside the economy and which eventually leads to inflation. Why does it lead to inflation? As we discussed it last night, it's primarily because the amount of resources that you put in the country, it has to be in line with the absorptive capacity of that country. When you are a highly populated economy, like in Iran, there is a lot of demand on the oil money. There are always demands for extra schools, for extra hospitals, for extra roads, for extra ports, and many other facilities. In order to meet all that, quickly and earnestly, you then expand your budget enormously in line with the oil income in order to meet all those demands which are put on the budget. And given the limit that the economy can absorb, you begin to have immediate bottlenecks in the process, as we experienced in Iran of the 1970s in particular, when the price of oil went 4 times in 1973-74. You may ask, what happens to a country like Norway? You can also have oil money, far in excess of the cost of producing oil. But when you are an industrialized country, there is much less demand on the government. Therefore, you have the luxury of having a sovereign fund, investing the oil money abroad, and spending it domestically as much as you think you can absorb it and you need it domestically. But in an oil-producing country which is highly populated and is developing, given all those resources, all those demands on the budget, and the fact that the politicians perhaps cannot say no, you end up with an enormous increase in the budget. Another feature of the oil income is that it's not consistently increasing at a certain determined level or rate. There is volatility in it, as there is volatility in the price of oil. So one year, and it happened exactly in 1974, the budget doubled in Iran. The following year, then the oil price went up only a percentage or two. But now you have this enormous increase. You've started a number of huge projects. And what you have to do now is to sustain that momentum. And interestingly enough, within 2 to 2.5 years, we ended up in a budget deficit situation in Iran, as rich as it was in 1973-74, and much more reliance on the banking system. In the book that Professor Tabakuri referred to, I try to explain the role that the central bank in Iran played during that time. I go back to 1960 in order to give the history of the central bank, because it started then. That's also an interesting phase of our life in Iran, in that 1960, and the establishment of the central bank was at the time of a new stabilization policy with the International Monetary Fund. Why? Because in the previous 2 or 3 years, starting from 1958, there was an enormous expansion of credit as a result of a revaluation of real and establishment of a new bank and the government's policy in order to promote industrialization. It led to a balance of payments crisis and a situation where Iran became completely dependent on foreign borrowing and then could not honor its obligations. Stepped in the IMF and established the central bank at the same time. There was this enormous stabilization policy, severely cutting imports. And that in itself paved the way for what we call the industrial import substitution industrial strategy in Iran in 1960 and 61, 62. By curtailing imports, it gave the stimulus for Iran to begin to industrialize itself. There was a major recession at the same time. We survived all that. And then that paved the way for a sustained growth in our economy starting in 1962. That, in all the literature, is alluded to the golden economic period in Iran's history. We had 10% real growth per year. We had 1.5% inflation. And we had balance of payments equilibrium. The key to it all, I go back to my old story, economic development, as Dr. Amuzagar called it, on oily legs. Because oil income was increasing gradually, in my view, in line with capacity of the economy to absorb it. When you look at the figures, you'll find, in fact, our income from oil was about maybe $500 million in the mid-60s, and then it began to go. It took about 4 years to reach $1 billion. During that period, we had low inflation. We had industrialization policies taking off. We had also real growth of non-oil GDP. And there came 1973. There came the jumping of the oil price 4 times to $12. And I explained to you from then on, we began to jump in our national income, if you like, but not gross domestic product, some 40% increase in our national income. But eventually it ended up to be negative. Inflation went up to 25% in 1976, if I'm not mistaken. And then we also eventually ended up with a balance of payment situation because the oil income had dipped. If I'm correct in what I say to you, that it is fiscal policy that matters most in a developing oil-producing country, then you may ask what role is left for the central bank and monetary policy. My immediate reaction is to say not very much. But if you have a chance to read Persian and to read the book, I will try to explain and say something more than just on the economic side. I try to explain why does the central bank matter, and why was the Central Bank of Iran in the 60s and the 70s was a model institution. At the time of Iran's economic management, we had 2 new and very powerful, in my view, government institutions, the Plan Organization and the Central Bank. We also had, of course, the Ministry of Economy, which was the coordinator of our economic policy, especially with industrial development. But primarily, these 2 institutions were in charge of the coordination and the budget, as well as the monetary policy. The special sides of the central bank, which are worth remembering, is that being a new institution, having been carved out of the National Bank of Iran, which was a commercial bank, it had to relate to the rest of the world. That in itself gave it an impetus to stay in touch with and stay current on the critical issues of the time. At the time, of course, we had only telex. There were no emails or faxes. But if you have dealing with foreign correspondents and they are on the telex machine waiting for your answer, you cannot sit on it. You have to act on it. The second part of the central bank was that because of it, perhaps partly, we spent a lot of time and energy on training people, institutions. By the time that I went to the central bank in 1975, a tradition had already been established on how to do things professionally and how to be faithful to the mission of the bank. And here is another story that I'm trying to tell in this book, and that is that when you read about Iran, the causes of revolution, or you try to summarize the time and the political system of the 60s and 70s, you often find, and I'm sorry to say it's also true of those scholars in the universities who write about it, we have always a tendency to summarize and to shorten in order to explain things. So we refer to that time, the time of dictatorship, government by fiat, arbitrary rule. There are many expressions of political scientists who try to describe the political system in Iran. In this book, I have tried to explain that even in the dictatorship, there are institutions, not only they matter, but they also act according to what was the law of the time. They were also served by some of the finest civil servants that Iran had ever produced. not only at the high level of governor or deputy governor or members of the board, but also at the staff level, which was critical. And I witnessed it, I inherited it. I noticed how much my predecessors had contributed to the establishment of that bank and the manner in which things are done. I noticed it that the entire system was built to protect the bank against maybe governors like myself, a newcomer who doesn't know what central bank is all about. And what we opened before ourselves, before we could clarify whether it's the right thing to do or not, was not the command of His Majesty, although we did have a number of them coming our ways. It was the law of the land, the 1351 central banking law in Iran, and the provisions of that, which define the mission of the central bank. But in what manner would that central bank be different from today's, let's say, Federal Reserve System in the United States or Bank of Canada? Times, of course, have changed. But the realities of our situation was also quite different. I alluded to the fact that the central bank was born in a recession. That explains a lot about the manner in which the central bank went about doing its business. It was not low inflation or zero inflation at all costs. It was part of the development process, that what do we do as part of our mission to contribute to the development of the country. And in the 60s, the central bank was operating at a time that inflation was not a problem. So, not being an issue, therefore, you joined forces with the plan organization, with the Ministry of Economy, to know what is the right thing to do in a coordinated fashion, so that the monetary policy will be complementary to our industrial policy, to our planning policy, to our overall development strategy. That development and growth strategy remain in the pinnacle of the operations of the central bank. Naturally, in the Federal Reserve System of the United States and Bank of Canada, you're also very much concerned about unemployment, you're concerned about recession, you take measures in order to come out of the recession. But these are unusual times, the unusual times of a recession in an economy, that you then gear your monetary policy when in fact you're concerned about falling prices to harness all the resources of the country in order to generate more employment, meaningful employment. In Iran, you have a different point of view, namely development. What do we do to ensure the development of the economy as a whole? Well, at the time of institution building in Iran, there was very much emphasis on when we are to industrialize, therefore, let's give the industrialists the new tools. And some of them, in fact, had a commercial or a merchant background and were not quite masters of new industries and how to go about them. Our answer in Iran was finding specialized banks, especially IMDBI, in which that my dear friend Mr. Zaidi was a member of on the staff. And with the support of the World Bank and international banking institutions, the idea was that we bring expertise in project evaluation and also at an interest rate which will be conducive and encouraging to the industrialists to do their business. These banks were also under the supervision, of course, of the central bank. But given that they had a development mission, they were always treated rather special in that they were doing part of the overall economic strategy of the country. Meanwhile, of course, the supervisory functions of the central bank remained paramount to the functions and the responsibilities of the management. And in those areas, given especially with the commercial banks, I think the central bank was very much on the top of the situation in terms of securing the soundness of the banking system. How to treat a bank which was non-performing in terms of assets, and how to correct the various measures. Of course, it was not perfect, but it was quite dominant. As a related idea, two things I'd like to elaborate was about our foreign exchange policy and about our interest rate policy. What happens in a situation like that? If you look at the interest rates prevailing at the time in the 70s in Iran, when in fact we had gone into a high inflationary situation, you may find that real interest rates, as we define them in economics, were not paramount in the economy. They were perhaps negative. But that was a time that when we had a fairly inflationary environment worldwide. If you look at the inflation rates in the industrialized countries, they were quite in their two-digit figures. You may remember in the 70s. That was partly because, or at least was the basis for the Shah and other members of the OPEC to use that as a basis to increase the price of oil. In a situation like that, even during my time, we used interest rates indicatively. You will find, in fact, that there are increases in interest rates in the 70s going up to 12% to 14%, which was fairly large in our country. But we allowed usually what we call the permissible. That means the banks were allowed their own discretion so long as they did not exceed those indicators. The case of exchange rate is something which again you find in Iran today. We kept it stable, with one change in 1968 as a result of the, as you know, the dollar was taken off the gold standard and the Nixon era and all the periods in which that there was much greater move to flexibility. We had a revaluation of about 9%, and then we stayed at 70 riyals per dollar. In a situation where, of course, we had a huge surplus in our balance of payments. And then inflation began to pick up. It went up, as I mentioned to you, I think, to 25%. We kept the interest rates the same. Meanwhile, as a result of the change in the environment worldwide, we had liberalized our capital accounts. That means Iranians were allowed to export as much as they wanted to in foreign exchange and to import. We had produced two separate markets in Iran, what we call commercial and non-commercial. The idea initially, at least on paper, was to differentiate between the two in terms of prices. But in practice, it turned out that you cannot have a dual exchange rate. It has to be one. Therefore, the central bank became the main supplier to the non-commercial side, which was not the original idea. And the rates remained the same. Interestingly enough, of course, at the much bigger dimensions today, the same debate takes place in Iran. They are facing different policy options, but nonetheless, whether to move the exchange rate in line with the differential in the consumer price index domestically and the prices of the exporting countries that are dealing with Iran, i.e. the industrialized countries, becomes a dominant feature of the economy. If you look what happened in Iran, they've had a number of shocks into the system with enormous changes. At the moment is about 2,950 toman, that is 29,000 riyals, to a dollar. And there again, within a year, it is now out of line with the rest of the world in terms of purchasing power. And the dilemma remains, even though Iran had earned some $700 billion worth of foreign exchange during the 8 years of the administration of Mr. Ahmadinejad from 2005 to 2012, the idea of keeping the exchange rate stable, that is highly overvalued in our terminology, in order to fight inflation. In fact, because you want to keep prices down. Whereas in fact, this way you're feeding into the fire. You're not fighting inflation. On the contrary, you're encouraging more imports at much cheaper prices at the expense of domestic production. And this is the dilemma they have in Iran today. One way of course, doing it is to try to bring the inflation down, which they are doing so. But meanwhile, the budget continues to be out of line, and the budget continues to be inflationary per se, creating a fair amount of monetary base for expansion of credit. One other feature that I like to touch on, and again compare the two, is the concept of independence of the central bank. I address it in the book, and I try to elaborate it today because it's also part of parliamentary debate in Iran today. How independent should the central bank be in conducting exchange rate policies, in conducting monetary policy, and in supporting the government's economic development? How independent should it be? When you raise that question, you should always have a supplementary, namely that independent of whom and by whom. In case of a central bank, when you're also basically the government's commercial bank, you ask yourself that, who is your main client? Like any commercial bank, I think you have to take note of who is your main client. In case of a central bank in Iran, it is the government. More importantly, the government is also your sole shareholder. So they sit there at the end of the year, look at your accounts. In today's Iran, the President of the Republic is the chairman of the General Council, at the General Assembly of the central bank, i.e. the shareholders' meeting. So the President himself sits together with 4 ministers to look at the accounts of the central bank. In my time, it was the Minister of Economic Affairs and Finance who chaired that meeting. The composition of the Monetary Council, which is in charge of monetary policy, again becomes a matter of how independent can a central bank be in its operations. It is extremely difficult to be able to be independent, again, in the tradition of the Federal Reserve in the United States or Bank of Canada, when your shareholder and your main client are both the same, represented by the same man, i.e. the Minister of Economic Affairs and Finance, or sometimes even the President of the Republic. It's very difficult to ignore that call when it comes through, if you're sitting at the central bank as a governor. And more importantly, you find that in a developing country, again like Iran, as like many others, development, as I mentioned to you, is a prevailing goal. Therefore, any central banker has many functions to perform. It is not just a single purpose of stabilizing prices, which is the main goal of the central bank. Even in the law itself, it says, perform these functions provided that, and in service of, and in order to help the development of the country, which remains the primary goal. With those in mind, the idea that the central bank can fight inflation at all costs is really extremely academic. And the purpose of this book at least I have said, is to try to explain the way in which we performed our functions at that time. And the idea, and I finish on this score, the idea of this book came to me because in many of the conferences that I had the privilege of attending, I noted there were a number of people who came from Iran. And they came from universities in Iran. And sometimes, on some of these conferences, I had a small panel talking about what I just talked to you about today. What happened in Iran of the 60s and the 70s. Suddenly, I found myself around me, after the conference, a fair degree of enthusiasm and interest in those who had come from Iran about what I had said. Because they said, you know, nobody has ever taught us that. Nobody had actually touched on these times in Iran, if only of us historic interest. And I thought, well, maybe there's a story here to tell, and that's why it's written in Persian, addressed ultimately to those in Iran, especially those who are students of history, who would like to read it. But as I see, and I get more encouraged when I read the daily papers in Iran, that there is now an audience, at least very politely, under the title Economic History, they refer to the Shah, his time, including the central bank and what happened then, or the plan organization. The stories of the 60s and the 70s, for the first time, is becoming a matter of public debate and even a matter of public comparison. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much.